January 24th, 1965. The world stands still. Winston Churchill is dead. For nearly 30 years, Dwight D. Eisenhower had spoken of Churchill with a careful mix of respect and restraint. The world saw Churchill as the unbreakable symbol of Allied unity, the bulldog who refused to yield when Europe teetered on the edge of annihilation. But behind closed doors, Eisenhower harbored a memory far more complex, shadowed by tension and necessity. Now, with Churchill gone, the old constraints were lifted. No more alliances to shield. No British leaders to appease. No fragile wartime balance to protect. For the first time, Eisenhower could speak freely about the man he'd once had to manage in silence. His words in the years that followed revealed a truth he'd long buried beneath the weight of history. Churchill had been essential, brilliant, and courageous, but also among the most challenging figures Eisenhower had ever encountered. Before they became legends, both men were shaped by utterly different worlds. Churchill was born into power, raised to believe the British Empire bent history to its will, and trained to command by force of personality. Eisenhower, in contrast, rose from Kansas's authority, forged by patience, discipline, and an unspoken understanding that leadership had to be earned, not inherited. When the winds of war brought them together, these differences weren't just philosophical, they became operational problems. By 1942, Eisenhower found himself in an unprecedented role, supreme commander of a coalition war. Now, victory depended not on battlefield heroics, but on unity, coordination, and the subtle art of keeping powerful allies from tearing each other apart. Meanwhile, Churchill fought a different war. Britain was battered, her empire stretched thin, her people scarred by endless nights of bombing and loss. Churchill saw himself not only as a wartime leader, but as the guardian of his nation's post-war future. From the outset, he tried to steer the war's direction personally, advocating for Mediterranean offensives and indirect strategies moves designed as much to preserve British influence as to avoid the catastrophic losses the country could no longer afford. Eisenhower always listened. He had to, but over time, a pattern emerged. Churchill's instincts, Eisenhower realized, were driven by memories of empire and politics, as much as by military necessity. Yet Eisenhower never challenged Churchill openly. The alliance depended on unity, at least on the surface. Behind closed doors, tension simmered. Eisenhower's duty was to win the war swiftly and efficiently. Churchill's was to ensure Britain would still matter when the dust settled. These goals weren't always compatible. Eisenhower would later confess, with a mixture of respect and exhaustion, that managing Churchill required as much energy as managing the enemy. He admired Churchill's courage, his refusal to bow to defeat in Britain's darkest hour. But that admiration couldn't erase the friction. Churchill questioned timelines, challenged priorities, and tried to influence operational decisions Eisenhower felt should remain strictly military. Eisenhower learned that sometimes silence, not argument, was the only way to keep control. This was the beginning of a relationship, defined not by friendship, but by containment. And as the war crept closer to Europe, the tension between these two giants would only escalate. The stage for the most decisive moments of their uneasy partnership. What happens when two visions for victory collide on the eve of history's greatest conflict? The answer would shape the fate of nations, and the legacy of both men. The year was 1943. The world was burning, and the Allied armies stood at a crossroads. North Africa had been wrestled from Axis control. Sicily had fallen, and now the question that would define the fate of Europe loomed. Where would the Allies strike next? To Eisenhower, the answer was as sharp as a blade: victory would not come from skirting the edges of Hitler's fortress. The heart of the Third Reich lay across the English Channel, in France. Every day spent hesitating gave Germany precious time to recover, regroup, and reinforce their deadly coastal defenses. But in London, Churchill saw the world through the scars of the First World War. He remembered the blood-soaked fields of Passchendaele, the endless lists of the dead, the horror of frontal assaults against entrenched enemies. For Britain, still reeling from years of loss, a direct invasion of France was a gamble that bordered on madness. Churchill lobbied for alternatives: continued strikes in the Mediterranean, an assault through Italy, attacks along the soft underbelly of Europe. Britain's influence, her very survival as a world power, was bound up in these choices. Yet these were not just military preferences, they were political calculations, each move a bid to maintain Britain's standing in a post-war world. Eisenhower understood this, even if he didn't agree. As Supreme Commander, his mission was brutally clear: end the war. Philosophy was a luxury he could not afford. The longer the Allies delayed a decisive blow against France, the more the coalition strained. American commanders grew restless. Soviet leaders struggled on the Eastern Front, demanded a second front to relieve the pressure. And all the while, German engineers carved bunkers, laid mines, and waited. Churchill did not hide his doubts. Assent Organt memoranda raised concerns in war rooms and pressed Eisenhower to reconsider. Every meeting was a contest of wills. Churchill, with his thunderous rhetoric and historical analogies, trying to steer the course of the war. Eisenhower, steady and unflinching, absorbing the pressure and quietly advancing his own agenda. It became a contest as perilous as any on the battlefield. Eisenhower had learned that open confrontation with Churchill was futile. The British Prime Minister thrived on debate and dissent. Instead, Eisenhower listened with care, responded with respect, and then, with a calm resolve, acted as necessity demanded. Operation Overlord, the audacious plan to land Allied armies on the beaches of Normandy, became not just the turning point of the war, but of their relationship. Churchill doubted the plan until the final hour. He worried over casualties, logistics, and the political consequences of failure. Eisenhower, however, saw a different danger: hesitation. As the final decision approached, Eisenhower accepted full responsibility. If the landings failed, he alone would bear the blame. It was a moment that crackled with suspense, a single choice that could doom or deliver the free world. June 6, 1944. The invasion began. Allied soldiers stormed the beaches. The world held its breath. And as the dust settled, it became clear. Churchill's influence, once the guiding hand of Allied strategy, was fading. The war's momentum no longer followed. British cautionates surged with American determination. Yet, victory had a price. The partnership that had once been held together by necessity was now being tested by the shifting tides of power. What neither man yet realized was that the next phase of their struggle would not be for Europe, but for the legacy of the world they were remaking. The summer of 1944 unleashed a new relentless tempo across Europe. Allied armies, under Eisenhower's command, surged out of Normandy and raced across France. German resistance, once ironclad, began to fracture. Some units collapsed at the first sign of Allied fire, while others fought desperately, sacrificing themselves to buy the Reich a little more time. For Eisenhower, this was a fleeting, precious window. Every mile gained was a nail in Hitler's coffin. Speed was everything. The faster the Allies advanced, the less chance Germany had to regroup. To Eisenhower, war had become a race against the clock, and any delay was a potential disaster. But in London, Churchill watched the rapid Allied progress with gnawing anxiety. He saw the risks in momentum, warning that a headlong rush could stretch Allied supply lines to the breaking point, expose vulnerable flanks, and tempt the enemy into devastating counterattacks. Caution, he argued, was vital. Every advance should be measured, every gain consolidated. Around every table, in every cable, His voice pressed for deliberation, never gambling more than Britain could afford to lose. Yet, that was only half the story. Churchill's strategic vision extended beyond the battlefield. He eyed the Mediterranean, still hoping to preserve British influence there. He worried, too, about the Soviet advance in the east, fearing that Stalin's armies might claim half of Europe before the West could react. Each decision, each argument, was shaded with the shadow of the world that would follow the fighting, a world in which Britain's place was far from secure. The tension between Eisenhower and Churchill sharpened over the issue of supply. Eisenhower pushed for a broad front offensive, pressing the Germans everywhere at once, never letting them rest or regroup. Churchill, joined by Field Marshal Montgomery, argued for a narrow, concentrated thrust, carefully supplied, meticulously planned, and designed to break through at a single decisive point. Compromise was inevitable, but compromise bred frustration. Operation Market Garden, proposed by Montgomery and strongly backed by Churchill, encapsulated this tension. It was bold, dramatic, and politically attractive. If it succeeded, the war might end by Christmas. But when the plan faltered, the fallout was severe. The Allies suffered heavy casualties, and the war dragged on. Eisenhower, ever disciplined, refused to lay blame in public. But in private, the lesson was clear. Even boldness could be fatal if it hid caution's true face. As time passed, the realities of command became inescapable. American strength now dominated the coalition, providing the lion's share of men, machines, and momentum. Eisenhower did not wish to diminish Churchill or the British contribution, but he could not, would not, allow nostalgia, prestige, or the fear of loss to dictate the fate of millions. Churchill sensed the shift. His cables became more frequent, his arguments more urgent. Yet Eisenhower's replies, once detailed and accommodating, proved terse, and the authority had shifted, and both men knew it, though neither spoke the truth aloud. This change was not born of disrespect. It was the burden of command, the knowledge that, in the end, responsibility rested on one man's shoulders. When strategy succeeded, the victory belonged to the alliance. When it failed, the blame fell squarely on Eisenhower's name. By the end of 1944, the partnership had been transformed. Churchill remained a giant tan icon of resistance and resolve, but control of the war's fate had passed to Eisenhower. The conflict was now shaped by cold logic, relentless movement, and the quiet, unyielding pressure of American might. Yet beneath the outward unity, a silent question gnawed at both men. When the last shot was fired, what would remain of their alliance? Would history remember their partnership as harmony, or as a contest of wills that only one could win? As winter closes in and the world awaits the final reckoning, Churchill and Eisenhower faced the most dangerous test of all. The struggle not for victory, as the thunder of war finally faded. Europe was left in ruins, and the alliance that had weathered the world's greatest conflict began to unravel beneath the weight of memory and shifting power. Churchill, ever the master of words, returned to politics and history, shaping the story of the conflict into a moral epic, one of character, courage, retreated into an unusual quiet. Eisenhower, his public words as a hero at home, his reflections deeper and more honest as the years unfolded. During the war, Eisenhower had mastered the art of diplomacies, saying less than he knew, holding back his truest judgments for the sake of unity. But peace created a new space, one in which he could finally admit what he'd hidden for so long. In private conversations and carefully measured recollections, Eisenhower's memories for Churchill sharpened into clarity. He never denied Churchill's role in the darkest moments of Britain's history. The Prime Minister's resolve in 1940 was the backbone of resistance, the spark that kept hope alive when defeat seemed inevitable. Eisenhower's admiration for Churchill's will never wavered, but now, for the first time, He spoke the truth he could never utter during the war. Churchill was not the modern commander the new era demanded. His instincts were shaped by an older world, by empire, scarcity, and the scars of the First World War. Eisenhower saw it clearly in retrospect. Where Churchill feared the dangers of speed, Eisenhower saw the perils of waiting. Where Churchill sought control and deliberation, Eisenhower trusted momentum and the ruthless application of pressure. They had fought not just different enemies, but different wars, one haunted by the ghosts of the past, the other racing to shape the future. The most difficult truth Eisenhower finally revealed was without malice or bitterness. Churchill, for all his greatness, often tried to fight the last war, while Eisenhower was already fighting the next one. The interventions, the memoranda, the endless arguments, these were rarely malicious. Eisenhower but sometimes grew convinced that, had Churchill been granted more operational authority in 1944, the war might have dragged on far longer, with even greater cost. Yet this realization never diminished Churchill in Eisenhower's eyes. Instead, it clarified his legacy. Churchill's greatest gift was not in the operational details, but in his refusal to surrender his ability to inspire when all seemed lost. Once America entered the conflict and the balance of power shifted, leadership itself had to change. Eisenhower became that change, whether the world acknowledged it or not. In the years that followed, Eisenhower spoke of Churchill with respect, but the romance was gone. He knew now that coalition warfare required compromise, patience, and a level of restraint few politicians possessed. Admitted, had been every bit as challenging as managing the enemy, because Churchill fought with words and influence, not just with soldiers and tanks. Eisenhower's final verdict on Churchill was not a condemnation, but a recognition shaped by the gravity of command. Churchill was indispensable when the world needed hope. Eisenhower became indispensable when the world needed action. Their partnership survived not because of their similarities, but because Eisenhower learned how to listen, when to stall, and when history demanded how to act without waiting for permission. In the silence after the guns, clarity came at last. The war was won not by force of personality, nor by the legends of the past, but by the acceptance of brutal reality and the courage to lead as the moment required. Only when the echoes of battle faded did Eisenhower truly see the shape of leadership. Acknowledge that, like war itself, it belongs to those willing to meet the demands of their time, not to those who cling to the world that once was. In the end, the story of Churchill and Eisenhower is not just about victory, but about the burden and truth of leadership, a legacy forged in the shadows between necessity and ambition, and remembered in the quiet after history's greatest storm.